Today we are starting this new message series entitled Shepherds and Sheep, right? Shepherds and Sheep. And I just want to ask you real quick, how many of you have ever farmed or ranched sheep? Have you ever done that before, right? There's two of you, all right? Two of you, right? So in that, can we just get up front? Is that most of us have never been a real live shepherd, right? I would be a good live shepherd because our shepherding now is set up with pens. Does that make sense? We keep them there. In Bible times, they're roaming on the side of a green hill, right? And they slept out there. The shepherds slept out there with the sheep. I'd be like, no, if that's what it takes to be a rancher, I'm not sleeping in the grass where lions and bears roam. Okay, I'm not doing that. But the reality is that we look at this shepherd and sheep. I just want you to know, I contemplated, how do we title this message series so it makes sense? And as I looked at it going through Scripture, I couldn't come up with anything better than what God's came up with. Isn't that pretty cool, right? And most of the time we'll go, oh, that's not culturally relevant, shepherds, right? Or sheep. How many of us farm or ranch sheep? Can I tell you that here's the beauty of the idea of shepherds and sheep, is that in over 60 times is the word shepherd referenced in the NIV Bible, with up to 114 times in plural form. Right? We talk about the word sheep over 500 times is the word sheep utilized in the NIV Bible within Scripture. And you can go through and do a word study. That's a lot more than other words that we hold in high esteem. Right? And so we decided, you know what, we're going to call it shepherds and sheep because that's what God has looked at this idea in what He's called it. And yes, it's culturally relevant to the time there, and maybe not overly culturally relevant, those terms, to us today, but biblically, I don't think there's a better analogy. Biblically, I don't think there is a better analogy to talk about what it is that we are going to be looking at over these next few weeks. You see, we see this as this word shepherd and sheeps, they're sheeps. Did you hear that? Sheeps, deers, shepherds and sheeps, shepherd and sheep, right? Is that the truth is that usually in Scripture it's related to a relational context. I mean, it does talk a lot about the idea in many cases that there was a shepherd out on the hillside tending his sheep, right, in a physical form. But more times than not, when we hear this idea of shepherd and we hear this idea of sheep, the context is that of a relationship. Many of you probably have heard the psalm, at least at a funeral, Psalm 23, right? It goes on it talks about Jesus really gives the idea of God being the shepherd. And it says that He lies me down in green pastures, right? And we talk a lot about it in depth, but the reality of Psalm 23 is more for the living than it is for the dead. It's about our life that we walk here and the life that we're in now, not when we die. We also see that there's this idea of the shepherd and sheep relationship within the church. In the New Testament, the word that you maybe see sometimes is elder, and other times the word is bishop. I mean, it depends what translation you use. We don't use the word bishop a lot around here because the word bishop kind of got a negative connotation within U.S. culture sometimes, right? But either way, it's all related to the word of shepherd, the idea of caring for the sheep. That is the role and the job of the shepherd, is to care for the sheep. See, the goal of this series is for us to better understand what the relationship between the shepherd and the sheep is supposed to look like. Jesus puts it this way in John 10. He says this, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, I know the Father, and I lay down my life for who? The sheep. See, Jesus tells this and uses this analogy to talk about this connection that this father, the great shepherd, has with his sheep. But there's an underlying idea here in this passage that there's this idea of sacrificial love. As if the shepherd, when he was out sleeping on the hillside with his sheep with no fence, right? He had a sling, or he had a sword, or he had a bow, and he was there to protect who? The sheep. He did whatever he could do. Now, some people got a little off. They'd say, well, you know what? If someone's attacking your cattle, you kill that coyote, right? Yes, with a high-powered rifle from 100 yards away, right? But the reality is, it was not about with a high-powered rifle from 100 yards away. It was hand-to-hand combat, living and dying for his herd. And it wasn't just about the money that the sheep would bring at the market, or the wool that the sheep would bring at the market. But it was about that there was a relationship there, that the sheep knew the sound of the shepherd's voice. And when the shepherd would call, they'd come running from the hillside and surround him. See, Jesus talks about this, is that in John 10, he says, I am the good shepherd. You see here, and what's interesting is there's this deep relational connection between the shepherd and the sheep that Jesus sets the table for us in John 21. Maybe you kind of remember this, is that Peter had already denied Jesus 3 times. Remember this? And then Jesus comes back around, and Jesus asks him like 3 times, Peter, do you love me? Right? And Peter's like, yes, Jesus, I love you. And then it says in Scripture, he gets a little perturbed. That's Nate's word, right? He gets a little perturbed. And I just wonder if the reason he doesn't get a little perturbed, Peter, is because Jesus is asking this question in front of other people, right? And Jesus says to him, if you love me, Peter, if you love me, he first says, feed my lambs, right? Then he asks him again, do you love me? And he says, take care of my sheep. And the 3rd time he says, Peter, do you really love me? And at this time, I think Peter's just boiling, right? Like, I don't know how many more times I have to tell you I'm embarrassed, I do things, and then I think about them later, right? Like, that's his personality. And he says this, Jesus says, then in John 21, verse 27, he says, Jesus said, if you love me, then feed my sheep. Feed my sheep. See, as his ministry is nearing an end on the earth, Jesus speaks to Peter. And he says to him, feed my sheep. Feed my sheep. I don't know if Peter fully understood what Jesus was telling him to do in that moment, right? But Peter was all about it. He was in, right? He said, Jesus, I love you. He says, feed my sheep. Okay, I get it. What's next, right? What's next? What's next? And Jesus predicts the way that he will die. Does Peter understand that? No, he's still focused on what? Feeding the sheep. And the task that Jesus himself has given him. You see, over the next 4 weeks, we'll be looking at this letter that Peter writes to the followers of Christ, who are experiencing things that you and I have never experienced in our own lives. He writes this letter to them, and he tries to give them encouragement as they're under Roman rule, as they're experiencing persecution. You name it, they've experienced it, or they had a friend or family who had. See, it's apparent as it begins here, as you turn to 1 Peter, is where we'll be at today. 1 Peter is at the end, towards the end of the Bible, very small, you'll miss it in a few chapters. So if you turn quickly, you might miss it. But apparently as Peter begins to write this, fast forward from the moment when Jesus calls him and tells him to feed his sheep, to the moment that Peter has lived in life and ministry, now he's writing this letter to them. He apparently begins to understand more clearly what it meant to feed the sheep, what their need was for a shepherd. And obviously, when the most difficult time is when the sheep need a shepherd the most. In 1 Peter 1, verse 6, it says this. Peter writes to them, he says, in all this you greatly rejoice. Though now for a little while you may have to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, will perish even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. See, Peter writes these words to them not just with a sympathetic heart, but with an empathetic heart, right? One of the greatest things a shepherd can be is to understand what it means to be a sheep. And Peter understands that based off of what his life was after he said yes to feeding the sheep. We look at the book of Acts and we see there's account after account where Peter had situations where he had to step up and actually felt the same persecution, felt the same trial that these people were feeling. Peter starts at the beginning of Acts where he preaches the message to those after Jesus' resurrection, to the Jewish population, those who had crucified Christ. He stands in front of them and doesn't mince words. He uses and teaches them the truth of the fact that Jesus was killed by you because you did not know who he was, and your sin put him on the cross. Thousands came to know Christ that day. Later in Acts we see it, and you can read through it, there's different accounts where Peter had different run-ins with the religious elite or the religious rulers. We see towards in Acts 17 and following is that we see there was a time that Peter was thrown in jail with John for what? Preaching the good news, preaching the gospel. The religious leaders didn't like that, and they came to them and said, shh, be quiet, stop doing that. Don't you love that? Religious people think that the way you get other people to do what they want to do is just by telling them to stop, right? And Peter and John said, okay, and what they do continued on. See, Peter writes this letter to them not with just a sympathetic heart, but an empathetic heart. He had lived where they lived. He experienced what they experienced. And he was willing to tell them to keep going where they needed to go because his heart was there with them. You see, this is a sign of a good shepherd, is the one who understands this truth, is that our trials are less than God's faithfulness. Our trials are less than God's faithfulness. This truth isn't just new for Peter. I mean, it's not just, Peter didn't come up with this, right? We even see back, as David writes in Psalm 100, where he talks about his understanding of the good shepherd. He says, know that the Lord is God. It is He who made us, and we are His people, the sheep of His pasture. See, that same belief that Peter had as he teaches the church, or reminds them to be faithful, is the same truth as that David locked his heart and mind around when he became a man after God's own heart. Is that he understand the truth that the shepherd was the one, that God was the one, Jesus was the one that was going to understand his pain. And therefore he was willing to share that with others and teach the church to be mindful no matter what you're facing. God's faithfulness is always going to be greater than your trials. You see, for some of you today, I say that word trial, I want you just to think of something here for a moment. When you think of the word trial, what do you think of? I think of jury duty, all right? That's what I think of, right? And the reality is, the reason I think of it is because in our culture, that's where people are what? Convicted or set free, is in the courtroom. But in some ways, I think if we're honest, when Peter writes this, is that he looks at the idea, and the truth is, I think we all need to, is that the courtroom of life is where we will experience trials. That when we wake up on Monday and go to bed on Saturday and didn't sleep much in between, we can consider that trial. For you, a trial might be different than for somebody else, but the shepherd always knows. The great shepherd always knows what your trial is. He knows what you're going through. He knows what you're experiencing. And now the question is, if you are the shepherd out on the hillside and the sheep are around, does the shepherd go and take the sheep away and isolate them from what is happening? No. He allows them to be part of the flock and tends them and keeps the enemy away. See, Peter understood this, and David understands this. You see, we see this in this passage here in 1 Peter 1:6, or in 1 Peter 1, is that this is Peter's letter to the sheep, and he tells them that there is time to rejoice in their grief or their sufferings. I don't know about you, but I'm not the best at rejoicing in my trials. I'm not the best at rejoicing when I suffer. Right? But Peter gives them really three reasons of why it is that they're supposed to look to the shepherd, or what that relationship looks like with the shepherd and the sheep in a time of trial and a time of grief. In verse 3, it starts with this. The first thing is this. He says, celebrate, and it talks about our new birth. He has given us a new birth into a living hope. Verse 3. That's not anyone around you. That is Jesus Christ. This is giving the opportunity for a new life, a new hope. Last week we had a few people who chose to be baptized into Christ. And if you're on social media, we have a little explaining to do apparently, all right? After our 11 o'clock service, we had a young man named Ryan who comes up, and Ryan says, you know what, I want to be baptized. We said, okay, the place is already clearing out. We already had one baptism, and so the towels were kind of wet, right? We had a few left over. And Ryan said, I didn't bring any clothes. I just came as I am. And I said, that's fine. We get back there, and he says, oh, I don't really have any clothes. He says, can I just jump in there quick, take my clothes off? And I thought, you know what? No, not quite, right? I will stand before God at some point, but we'll figure this out. We're not going to hinder anyone from getting baptized. So what's Ryan do? He strips down to his boxers, wraps a towel around him, Old Testament style, right? No shirt on, jumps in the baptistry. And we baptize him into Christ. Here's the best part. Someone videoed it, posted on Facebook. Excellent deal, right? We had people that liked it from all over the place. This guy's getting baptized, and all you can see is he's naked from the waist up, right? And now we're probably known as the church that baptizes people naked. That's not what we do, right? All joking aside, the truth is Ryan understood and the others understood what it meant to accept that new birth that God offers. You see, he accepts the new birth that God offers. This is what Peter writes about the shepherd and the sheep relationship. The shepherd understands about the new birth. The sheep need to be reminded. You see, even, I don't know about you, but we have a dog. And that dog, she's not my dog. Okay? She's not my dog. We actually got that dog from, I don't know how many years ago now, from a couple in the church that their purebred little schnauzer got out one night, right, and hung out with the neighbor dog, which they don't know who it is, right? And so the purebred pups weren't going to be purebred, and so they had these puppies, and I thought this was a really great idea. Let's bring a puppy home to my daughters, right? And so we did that, and did the good dad thing, and thing's still alive, okay? Like, it's an outside dog, and the kids are attached to it now, so there's no way to give it a ride to the farm. Does that make sense? But I have to tell you, that dog always is dependent upon my daughter feeding it. Always dependent. It comes to the deck, it has its bowls, there's a water bowl and a food bowl, but if that water bowl is not full, no, the dog is not going to fill it himself. Right? If the food bowl is not full, the dog's not going to fill it himself. And the reality is that's a relationship issue that we need to understand. If I had a dog that could fill their own bowl, we'd be much better friends, right? It would be, and even if the dog had a job, it could bring income into the family, it would be even better because it can hold its own weight. But I have to tell you, that us as sheep, we as sheep need to understand, is that the shepherd, the great shepherd, always understands. He always understands the need for our new birth. He understood it and believed in it so much he came and died for us so that we'd have the opportunity for new birth. But we need to be reminded in our time of trial, is that possibly we've accepted the gift of the new birth. We need to be reminded of that. For others, it might mean that you need to take on that new birth, accept that gift for the first time, to understand what the trials are in front of you. I do want to tell you, as a believer and an unbeliever, when people come to my office, they can go through the exact same things, but they have two different responses many times. Throw it out there to you is that if you think about it, Peter writes this about the new birth, and he shares that this is what we need to be mindful of. The second thing he shares with them and gives them is talks about a real inheritance. In verse 4, he says that there will never perish, spoil, or fade. What he's saying is there's an eternal inheritance. How many of you ever inherited something that you're really excited about? Have you ever got that before? I mean, sarcastically excited about, right? I grew up in a family where there's not a lot that's going to be passed down, right? It's just going to be what's left over. We call it options. Okay, that's what we call it. But I have to say, no matter what the greatest thing that's been given to you, whether it's a home or a car or just green cash, it will all go away. It will all spoil and fade. It will all not go with you. As the old adage says, you've never seen a hearse with a U-Haul, right? But the truth of the matter is in the time of trial, Peter writes, he says, remember your real inheritance. When your family is being killed, is what he writes, and underneath this, when your family is being persecuted, when your home is being burned to the ground, understand all of it is just temporal. What will last forever is what you have as an inheritance in Jesus Christ. See, Jesus says it himself. He reminds us, do not store up where moth and rust will destroy. One of the relational roles of a shepherd is to point sheep back to this truth. It isn't easy all the time to see what is temporal. It isn't always easy all the time to discern between what is temporal and what is eternal. But we need to be pointed back by the shepherds to what truly matters. See, even in the greatest of things, we need to be pointed back. We've been planning this party for our son's adoption, right? Like, we've been waiting 4 years, so thought is, let's do this big, right? Like, my daughters might not ever have a wedding, but we're having an adoption party. You get my gist, right? And they're getting married, and just, never mind, forget that, okay? But we've talked about it. I mean, we've talked about, like, what about petting zoo? Like, how often that be, right? And our daughter Gabby says, I don't really like animals like that, but if you get a llama, that's awesome. Like, a llama? Like, that was disgusting, right? We thought about blow-up and bouncy houses. How awesome would that be, right? Kids bouncing all over. Once again, Gabby, the sour one that she is, she goes, Dad, remember when I bonked heads with that girl at that one party I had on a bouncy house? I'm not getting on those again. I'm like, okay, right? I mean, I've even thought to my wife, I said, Jules, what if we did this? What if we just rented out the K? Right? Like, if baseball starting with the Royals, we'll just get a section of it, and we'll just go there and invite as many people to come, and we'll find the cheap, the Wednesday ticket that's $8, you know what I'm talking about? And just go, and maybe they'll put, like, Jumbotron thing up there or something, or maybe Alex Gordon will come over and say hi to the kids and invite me to the clubhouse, like, that's what we go down, right? And all the ideas weren't really bad, and all of them started to cost a little bit more than we initially planned, right? But then all of a sudden I had this thought. I was like, is this party about you? Or is this party about something bigger? Right? And I got to tell you, I really want it to be about us, right? Like, because us, we'll take 3 days off. We'll go to a day and night game at the Royals, right? Great Wolf Lodge. I can go to the pool and not get sunburned, all those kind of things. But it clicked with me. You know, the truth is it about bigger things or is it about temporal things? You see, I say this is because Peter writes this in 1 Peter 5:1. He says, to the elders among you, I appeal as a fellow elder and as a witness of Christ's sufferings, who also will share in this glory to be revealed. He reminds them, he says, you know what, I've been where you've been, elders, shepherds. I've been there. I'm one of you, right? Understand what the importance is of what is taking place in the life of the people around. Understand what the importance is for you. I want you to know that. For your shepherds and your elders, you know when it's the most difficult to be a shepherd and an elder? Is when the sheep need it the most. Right? That's when it's most difficult. I mean, it's when the sheep go astray. No one wants to be a shepherd then. I mean, when the sheep are all following in line and going where they need to go, it's a blessed, wonderful thing. But when the sheep are all scattered, right? Or when they get their focus on temporal things and not on eternal things, we start worrying about different things that don't even matter. And the shepherds are the ones that have to tell the sheep, you hear this, what you are saying does not matter. You're focusing on the wrong things. See, Peter writes that to these guys because he's telling them that what is going on, even though as horrific as it is, do not focus on the temporal, focus on the eternal. Focus on the eternal because there is a real inheritance. Peter goes on to share also in verse 5 it said about their eternal security. Who through faith are shielded by God's power in the coming of the salvation. God is faithful in protecting and hedging us, not just from Satan's daily schemes, right? But from his eternal scheme. And understand that Satan's eternal scheme, his destination is already determined, church. I want you to know that. He already is lost. And God's letting him do his thing now because it's called free choice, it's free will. But as Peter writes us and says to them, remember about your eternal security. No matter what comes your way, no matter what you suffer, no matter what depression is upon you, no matter what financial strife, understand that God himself protects you. God himself has what's best interest, your best interest in mind. You see, as the band comes, we'll close with this. God has an interesting way of setting up this relationship with shepherds and sheep. Right? We all know that Jesus is the good shepherd. But can I close with this thought, church? And I want you to ponder on this over the next few weeks. And actually, it's going to be what we'll talk about here on Wednesday, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. Is that our view of the great shepherd, our view of Jesus and what his role as a shepherd to us is, hear this, will affect the way we view the shepherds in our church, in our expectation for them. I want you to hear this. Think of it this way. If Jesus is just a push button, thank you, give me what you need, protect me, always shepherd, right? We'll have the same expectation for who? Those who are shepherds in our church. If our truth or our expectation for Jesus the great shepherd is that he's going to lie us down by green pastures and everything's going to be great, but we never read the rest of it, right? Where he says, I walk through the valley of the shadow of life, no, death. And I fear no evil, not because everything's good, but because God is with me. Our expectation will be the same for those who shepherd us here in our local congregation. You see, I want to tell you this. On Wednesday nights here in the month of April, most of you got an email, if you use email, right? Some of you got some other messages. Is that through the month of April on Wednesday nights from 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock, we're going to have a thing called Closer Look. And what it's going to be is just a deeper, in-depth Bible study of what we spoke of or what the message was on Sunday. I'll lead you here. I'll be down here in the basement of lower level here this week. And with that being said, we'll come and talk about that question. What is our expectation of the Good Shepherd from Psalm 23? How do we view Jesus? Because the way we view Jesus, our expectation for Jesus will be our expectation for our shepherds. And let me tell you, that is a beautiful, great thing if our expectation is biblical of Jesus. But if it's not, guess what? the sheep run around like chickens with their head cut off, right? And it makes it difficult for shepherds to be shepherds. Church, I'm excited about these next 3 weeks as we look at this. We open up more clearly in 1 Peter, and we looked in Timothy and some other places about what has God called shepherds to be. What does God call us as sheep to be? Because you understand that there is no church that's healthy unless the sheep and the shepherds are healthy. There's no church that is healthy with limping sheep. There's no church that's healthy with limping shepherds. Will you stand with us as we pray?